A flight attendant poured juice on a baby, but the father's next move set their entire career ablaze. A flight attendant poured juice on the baby, thinking no one would notice. He didn't realize the father was ready to pour gasoline on their career instead. The moment that liquid spilled, the cabin's power dynamics flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The juice hit before the plane even reached cruising altitude. A sudden, sharp tension radiated through the cabin of Arius Jet Flight 409, not from turbulence, but from something far more human. Flight attendant Darren Vesk paused near row 12, his gaze fixed on a particular crib nestled beside a calm, dark-suited passenger. The crib was standard issue, safely buckled and silent, yet Darren stared at it as if it were a breach of security. His lips thinned. His expression flickered with something too practiced to be polite and too forced to be sincere. Leander Cross felt it. The stare, the pause, the air around him stiffening like cold fabric. He didn't look up at first. He was busy checking the small latch on the crib, ensuring it was secure against the floor, and gently adjusting the yellow blanket that covered his 6-month-old son, Kalen. The infant, peaceful and unaware, made a soft exhale in his sleep. His tiny fingers curled near his cheek. Darren finally moved, but not before giving the crib one last sideways glance. It was the kind of look people reserved for something they'd already decided was a problem. Leander, though aware of it, said nothing. He had flown enough to know that silence was often the better shield, especially when traveling with a child. Still, something about the attendant's posture unsettled him. Not fear, exactly, but the unmistakable signal of a storm forming in still air. The aircraft continued boarding as cabin sounds blended into a lull, the shuffle of carry-ons, buckles clicking, polite greetings from the cockpit speaker. "Welcome aboard, Flight 409 with non-stop service to Norvane. I'm Captain Jaron Vielle. We're expecting a smooth ride this evening." The voice was calm, unhurried, and steady, but for Leander, that steadiness now felt like surface tension on water, serene above, but hiding something deeper. Leander shifted in his seat, glanced toward the galley, and caught Darren whispering to another flight attendant, taller, broader, and younger, whose name tag read Corvin Hale. The two of them leaned in slightly, speaking too quietly for words to reach row 12, but the direction of their glances was not subtle. Twice they looked over. Once, Corvin raised an eyebrow. Darren nodded, expression souring. The engineer in Leander, the part of him trained to detect misalignment, small faults before they became systemic failures, did not miss the pattern. He told himself not to jump to conclusions. But his grip on the armrest tightened. Kalen stirred briefly, and Leander reached down instinctively to steady the crib, then stroked his son's chest lightly to soothe him back to sleep. That yellow blanket, worn but carefully folded, was a relic of memory. A gift from Leander's older brother, Malen, who had passed away just over a year ago. In the quiet, Leander had often used that blanket as a kind of compass. Today, it reminded him of calm strength. He needed both. "Excuse me," came Darren's voice, abrupt and toneless. Leander looked up. The attendant was beside his row again, too soon, pretending to check seatbelts. But his hand never reached for the straps, only hovered briefly before returning to his waist. His eyes, however, settled again on the crib. "Yes?" Leander asked, tone neutral. "No issue," Darren said curtly. "Just a routine check." He lingered for a heartbeat longer, then pivoted away with mechanical precision. Leander's eyes followed him, narrowing. The man wasn't adjusting anything. He was watching them. The engines hummed louder as the plane pulled back from the gate. Flight attendants passed through for final checks. Darren didn't look back this time, but Corvin did, glancing from over his shoulder with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. A subtle shift was happening, one that most passengers might not notice. But Leander felt it, not just directed at him, but at the space he occupied. as if his presence with a baby had disturbed some invisible hierarchy. He recalled a phrase someone once told him: "People don't show you who they are when everything's calm. They show you when they think no one can stop them." The ascent began smoothly. Lights dimmed slightly as the cabin tilted skyward. Kalen let out a soft whimper but didn't cry. Leander adjusted his seat slightly, bringing the crib closer to his knee. His instincts were flickering again, not as engineer now, but as a father. He could feel something wasn't right, not from the aircraft, but from the humans inside it. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. His keynote presentation in Norvane was important, possibly the pivot point for his small firm, Vasidian Labs. But in this moment, none of that mattered more than the child beside him. He needed this flight to be quiet, controlled, smooth. But already the cracks were forming. A moment later, as the seatbelt sign blinked off and passengers began to stir and relax, Leander noticed Darren at the front of the cabin again. This time, he wasn't moving. He was watching. Not openly, but enough. Leander caught the glance, then saw Darren whisper something else to Corvin before both attendants vanished behind the curtain near the galley. Leander leaned back, tightening his jaw. The tray table in front of him rattled softly from cabin pressure shifts. He reached down and checked the crib's mount again. Then, softly, he said aloud, but only to himself, "This doesn't feel like turbulence." His hand rested on the edge of the crib as Kalen shifted gently in his sleep. The yellow blanket had bunched to one side. Leander adjusted it, smoothing it over his son's chest like a shield. Something subtle, something measured, was happening around them. And whatever it was, Leander could feel the center of it forming right where he sat. He believed the flight would be routine, but the first crack in that belief had already appeared. The orange juice hit with an audible splash. It soaked the soft fleece of Kalen's yellow blanket and sprayed across the baby's delicate face, the acidic liquid seeping into his cheeks and catching in the corners of his barely open eyes. For a single second, time in the cabin seemed to pause. Then came the infant's terrified cry, raw, sharp, and unmistakably panicked. Leander Cross jerked forward instinctively, his hands reaching to shield his son, but the spill had already done its damage. Juice was dripping down Kalen's temple, soaking his hair and clothing in streaks of pulp-stained wetness. Leander blinked, trying to process what had just happened. Across from him, Flight Attendant Darren Vesk stood rigid, holding an empty cup tilted slightly downward as if pretending to still be surprised by gravity. His lips formed a slow, insincere curl. "Oops," he said flatly. Leander's eyes locked with his, searching for any trace of genuine remorse. He found none, only a flicker of disdain, quickly masked behind professional indifference. But the damage wasn't in the accident, it was in the precision, the angle, the moment, the certainty. This wasn't clumsiness. It was deliberate. Kalen's cries escalated into a choked wail. Leander shifted quickly, cradling his son and whispering calming words that sounded hollow over the shrill panic. His shirt sleeve mopped uselessly at the mess, blotting sticky patches from his child's forehead. His fingers trembled, not with fear, but a deep, coiled rage begging to surface. A few passengers turned to look, some frowning, others murmuring softly. Row 6 craned to see. Row 5 sat frozen. No one else had spilled a drink. No tray had tilted. No sign of turbulence. Darren didn't even bother apologizing again. He simply turned, eyes scanning the cabin, then began walking away as if nothing had happened. Leander's voice followed him. "Excuse me," he said, firm but controlled. "You need to bring towels. Now." Darren paused, glanced back over his shoulder, and said without turning fully around, "I'll see what I can do." The words came with that same odd tightness, scripted, hollow, and mechanical. It wasn't a crew member addressing a concern. It was a man protecting a performance. Leander sat still for a moment, his arm tightening around Kalen. His thoughts raced. This wasn't random. Darren had passed them twice earlier without any cause. He'd lingered. He'd stared at the crib as though it offended him. Now, this. Leander didn't need a background in psychology to recognize the pattern. Escalation by manipulation. Pressure masked as procedure. It was something he'd seen play out in boardrooms before, but never 30,000 feet above ground, and never with his son as the target. He glanced at the tray table. The juice had barely touched anything else, just the baby. "Kalen, I've got you," he whispered, voice low and even. The child's cries slowly faded into soft hiccups, his little fists curling against Leander's chest. The father kissed his son's temple gently, letting the contact ground him, even as anger throbbed under the surface like a second pulse. Around them, the murmurs of witnesses slowly quieted. No one had stood up. No one had called the attendant back. The tension in the cabin turned into something Leander recognized all too well: fear of being next. He sat upright, adjusting Kalen's blanket so that the wet patches were away from his skin. His mind was shifting now, no longer just reacting. Calculating. Why would Darren risk something so obvious? Why choose such a public move? Then it struck him. This wasn't just about humiliation. It was about framing, creating a provocation that could be used later. Twist the truth, blame the cries, turn concern into aggression. Leander exhaled slowly through his nose. If this was a trap, he would not walk into it. Behind him, he heard the faint whisper of shoes brushing the aisle. Turning slightly, he caught sight of the other flight attendant, Corvin Hale, leaning in to speak quietly with Darren near the galley. Their heads tilted toward each other, their glances sharp, occasionally flicking toward row 7. His row. Leander memorized the positioning. Corvin held a small tablet. Darren was nodding slowly. No towels, no cleanup kit. Just more watching. The plan was layered, and suddenly the incident with the juice felt like an opening move. Leander's hands curled into fists on his lap. His instincts weren't just sharpened from engineering. They were honed through pressure, through watching systems fail from invisible cracks no one else noticed. But this time, he wasn't managing a crisis in a lab. He was in one, and his son had been the test subject. He straightened. Every part of him wanted to call them out, loudly, publicly, but he knew better. If they were baiting him, then emotion would be ammunition. He couldn't afford that. Instead, he reached for his carry-on bag under the seat. From inside, he pulled out a sealed microfiber cloth, the kind he used to clean sensitive equipment. It wasn't much, but it was clean and soft. He gently wiped Kalen's cheeks, then dabbed at the soaked collar of the baby's onesie. "Shh, you're okay," he whispered again, his voice a calming rhythm. Kalen stared at him with watery eyes, then closed them with a soft whimper. The moment held, a fragile equilibrium between silence and escalation. But Leander's thoughts were no longer on peace. They were on preparation. Darren wanted a reaction. He would not get it. Not yet. Leander's retaliation would come, not through yelling or confrontation, but through evidence, patterns, witnesses, and the right timing. And yet, even as he sat there, collecting himself, he couldn't shake one final creeping thought. What if the juice wasn't just about humiliation? What if it was meant to build a file? Something deeper? His gaze drifted to the curtain behind which Darren had vanished. He felt it, not fear, not even anger, but certainty. This was no accident. The moment the juice hit his son's face, Leander understood this was no accident at all. The moment the fake negligence slip hit Leander's tray table, the air around him thickened with silent judgment. He didn't speak, not immediately. Instead, he stared at the paper, its cheap texture, its off-center logo, the font spacing that didn't match the airline's usual branding. A forged document, amateurly done. slipped across the plastic tray with the same casual confidence as someone trying to stage a lie and hoping no one would look too closely. But Leander always looked closely. He was an engineer by trade, a pattern analyst by instinct. And something about the way Darren delivered it, no towels, no apology, just accusation, confirmed what Leander had begun to suspect. This wasn't about his son crying, it was about power. He picked up the paper slowly, his fingers still slightly damp from wiping orange juice off his son's face. Kalen whimpered softly, cheeks flushed and lips trembling as he clutched the edge of Leander's shirt, sticky with juice. The cabin hadn't settled after the incident. It had shifted, subtly, uncomfortably. Conversations slowed. People leaned in without making it obvious, sensing that something unspoken was escalating row by row. "Is this a joke?" Leander asked, his voice calm, eyes fixed on Darren. "No, sir," Darren replied, his tone almost rehearsed. "It's protocol. We issue these when there's risk of harm to a minor during flight." "A risk you created?" Leander's eyes narrowed and his voice dropped low, sharp as wire. "You poured juice on my son's face." Darren gave a tight-lipped smile and tilted his head as if Leander were being unreasonable. Behind him, Corvin Hale appeared again, arms crossed. His presence was less aggressive, but no less complicit. His expression wore the same smirk of a man used to getting away with things in silence. "Sir," Corvin interjected in a voice that sounded practiced. Traveling with infants can be challenging. Sometimes parents struggle to maintain order, and cabin crew have to intervene. For safety. Leander turned his head slowly toward him, the paper still between his fingers. "He was asleep, until your colleague spilled juice on him." Corvin didn't respond. He just looked past Leander, as though addressing the issue had already drained his interest. That's when Leander felt it. Not just anger, but design. These two had coordinated something. Maybe not the spill itself, but the response. A script. A strategy. And he'd walked into it, strapped to a seat thousands of feet in the air with a baby too small to defend and a situation too absurd to shout about without being labeled disruptive. He inhaled slowly through his nose, then exhaled, quiet and steady. He tucked the forged slip into his front jacket pocket without another word and looked down at Kalen, who was now sniffling softly. Leander unbuttoned the cuff of his shirt and used the sleeve to gently wipe his son's chin, cheeks, and the small streaks of juice drying into a stickiness along his jaw. Still, no towels. "Excuse me," he asked a male passenger across the aisle, voice low. "Did the cart pass by your row before us?" The man, a slim, middle-aged fellow with a gray buzz cut, shook his head. "No, they came straight here first." A clue. Leander nodded and resumed wiping Kalen's face, now fully aware that nothing happening around him was coincidence. He pressed the button above his seat for assistance. The light blinked yellow. Neither attendant moved. The tension spread like smoke. A man in row 7 whispered something to the person next to him. Another 2 passengers leaned forward slightly, as if gathering context without stepping in. One man, a sharp-eyed older passenger across the aisle, cleared his throat softly and said, "That one, Darren. He was nearly fired last month. Behavior thing. My neighbor works in dispatch." Leander didn't react, but the information landed like a silent alarm. Reprimanded, not removed. That meant the airline knew. That meant this wasn't an isolated incident. Kalen coughed. A soft, confused sound, followed by a hiccup of a cry, small but piercing. Leander rocked the crib slightly, adjusting the straps and checking the airflow. His son's tiny hand reached up and grabbed his finger. The instinct in Leander wasn't rage, it was calculation. Retaliation wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be impulsive, it would be correct, precise. He glanced down the aisle again. Darren and Corvin were whispering, faces angled away from passengers, voices low. Every now and then they peeked in his direction, as if ensuring their next move still fit their plan. Leander watched their body language. Darren's right hand kept reaching for the back of his waistband, nervous habit. Corvin tapped the edge of the galley wall twice every time he finished a sentence. Nervous system glitches. Tell signs. Then it hit him. They weren't targeting just him. They were running a pattern, a program, a system of quietly identifying passengers they didn't like, labeling them as disruptive, and documenting them as problems to justify pre-planned consequences. The forged slip wasn't the start. It was the middle of a long, corrupt playbook. Passenger tiering, Leander whispered under his breath. He'd read about it on obscure forums. A rumored practice in some low-accountability airlines where attendants created internal watch lists of passengers based on class, behavior, race, or parental status. Nothing ever proven. But suddenly, it wasn't a theory anymore. It was unfolding in front of him. He looked again at the slip in his pocket. He'd studied corporate formatting for years, fonts, line weights, margins. And this one was off. Sloppy. Slipped out fast. They didn't expect it to be questioned. He pressed the assistance button again. Still no response. Kalen's cries sharpened slightly. Leander leaned over the crib and stroked his cheek gently. "It's all right," he murmured. "They think this is enough to break me. It isn't." The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling a shift in flight mode. Leander stayed alert. He didn't know what was coming next, but he had seen enough systems break under stress to understand what to do. Study the pattern. Find the fault. Break it from the inside. He folded his juice-stained sleeve back into place, lifted the crib strap once more, and leaned his head slightly back against the seat, eyes scanning quietly, mind already working. He would not let Kalen grow up remembering fear in a place meant for peace. He would not let lies become the official record. He would not react emotionally. That's what they wanted. That's what they needed. No. He would observe, strategize, wait. Because now he had confirmation that the incident wasn't random. It was part of something worse, and whatever this game was, they'd just underestimated the player in seat 10C. Leander realized he needed a plan before the situation spiraled into something even darker. Darren returned again, his approach slicing through the cabin like a cold wind. His jaw was tight, his stride stiff, and his voice carried a brittle sharpness as he stopped directly in front of Leander's row. Without preamble, he leveled a charge. "You are creating a disturbance," Darren said, loud enough for passengers nearby to hear. "Your infant's prolonged crying is intentional. It's clearly aimed at provoking crew." Leander blinked slowly, not in disbelief, but in controlled calculation. His hand rested protectively across Kalen's small chest, feeling the flutter of his son's breathing against his palm. Kalen had calmed minutes ago, nestled into the warmth of Leander's side, but now stirred, sensing the tension in the air again. "That doesn't make sense," Leander said quietly, his tone steady. "He's a baby. He cried because he was soaked in cold juice." From behind Darren, Corvin Hale appeared like a silent shadow, his presence not stated but fully implied. He hovered just over Darren's shoulder, nodding faintly, his eyes trained not on Leander but on the other passengers, measuring their reactions. "I'll be reporting this to the captain," Darren declared, drawing himself taller. "Disruptive behavior, potential noncompliance, verbal escalation. That's 3 notations." Leander tilted his head, expression unreadable, though the burn behind his calm eyes was unmistakable. His silence was not submission. It was the sound of restraint under pressure. Then a voice broke the fog. "That's not what happened," a man from row 8 said firmly. He rose halfway from his seat, fingers gripping the headrest in front of him. His tone was cautious but unwavering. "I saw it. You threw the juice. It didn't spill. You leaned in and flicked your wrist." Several heads turned toward the man. Darren shifted, only slightly, but enough for Leander to note the micro-expression of alarm. It was quickly buried beneath mock authority. "There was turbulence," Darren said flatly. The aircraft jolted. If you weren't so focused on eavesdropping, you'd have noticed. But the passengers had noticed. And not just one. "There was no turbulence at that time," another man muttered. "I'm a pilot. I was watching the wing. Dead smooth." Darren's eye twitched, but he said nothing. Corven stepped closer now, the two attendants aligning in body language like chess pieces forming a wall. Leander remained seated, still as stone, but his mind raced. They weren't improvising anymore. They were following a plan. Then it came, a soft whisper just behind the attendants, exchanged too carelessly. "You think Renner's going to cover this one too?" Corven said under his breath, only partially turned. "Doesn't matter," Darren murmured back. "He told us to keep them in check. We're doing exactly that." Leander heard it. His fingers curled slightly against the armrest. A flicker of memory passed, of Kalen smiling just that morning in the terminal, wrapped in the yellow blanket Leander's brother had once carried across oceans during college. That smile now lay under scrutiny, soaked by malice masquerading as policy. He understood. This was deeper than personal pettiness. It was institutional, strategic, possibly even rehearsed. As Darren stepped away to make his false report, Leander turned to face his child fully. Kalen blinked up at him, face still damp, cheeks flushed, lips moving softly in a nearly formed whimper. But he didn't cry. He stared, trusting, silent, absorbing his father's presence like warmth in a cold place. Leander leaned forward slightly. His voice was low, close to Kalen's ear. "Everything's going to be all right," he whispered. "I promise." And yet, beneath that promise, a flicker of truth burned in his chest, that it might not be all right. Not yet. Not until something changed. He looked past Kalen, past the curtain of complacency that separated economy from first class, past the uniforms and forced smiles. His analytical mind, honed through years of system diagnostics and failure recovery, kicked into full gear. He began processing each word, each movement, each contradiction. They claimed turbulence. He would document the flight log. They cited a disturbance. He would gather witness accounts. They tried to isolate him. He would expose the system behind them. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to fight. He just needed to do what engineers do best: observe the pattern, find the fault line, and apply pressure at the exact point of failure. Kalen's hand reached up, brushing against his father's collar. Leander smiled faintly, but his eyes were focused now. Not on fear, not on anger, but on preparation. A different kind of turbulence was coming. He knew the next move he made had to expose the truth without letting anger take the lead. The camera was already rolling when Darren Vesk reappeared, clutching a slim, gray recording device. His grip was firm, too firm, and his posture spoke not of duty, but of intent. Without hesitation, he raised the recorder toward seat 14A and pressed the red button. "Passenger is exhibiting erratic behavior," he began coldly, his voice flat but sharp enough to carry across rows. "Subject has aggressively shaken his infant during emotional outburst, witnessed by staff." The words echoed like a thunderclap in the sealed cabin. Leander didn't move. Kalen whimpered quietly in his lap, face still damp from the earlier orange juice spill. The baby's wide eyes blinked up at his father, unaware of the storm forming above his head. Around them, passengers stirred, murmurs rising, some leaning into the aisle to get a better look. One man audibly muttered, "That's not true." Darren continued his narration, shifting slightly to angle the recorder more dramatically, as if framing a scene. Passenger was advised multiple times about flight safety and handling of minor. Aggression was documented by cabin crew. "Stop," Leander said, his voice quiet but cutting through the air like a wire drawn taut. He didn't yell. He didn't rise. But his stillness was louder than Darren's accusations. Darren froze, just for a second. Then Leander calmly reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a matte black cylinder. He thumbed the top. A soft blue light blinked to life. "I'd like to document this too," Leander announced clearly, turning the device toward Darren. "For the record." The silence that followed was sudden and deep. Corvin Hale, watching from the side, stiffened. Darren hesitated, his recorder still held aloft, but his face lost a shade of color. Leander kept the microcam steady, its lens unblinking. "If you're going to accuse me," Leander continued, voice steady and public now, "let's make sure the cabin hears everything, starting with a few questions." He didn't wait for permission. "Why was no towel provided after the spill, if it was truly an accident?" he asked, voice rising just enough to carry. Darren opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. "Why did you hand me a negligence slip that doesn't match the airline's documented format? Why did you cite turbulence that didn't occur? Why has no crew member acknowledged the witnesses who clearly saw what happened?" Darren's mouth worked uselessly, then shut. Passengers were no longer murmuring. Now they were watching. Phones lifted, cameras pointed. In row 3, a young man with a tech badge angled his screen toward the aisle, quietly recording. Across from him, an older gentleman reached for his phone with a determined frown. A sense of collective awareness moved through the cabin like static. Leander continued, one hand on Kalen's back, the other holding the microcam like a spotlight. "If this is how your airline handles fathers traveling with children," he said, "then let every word be recorded, not just yours." The grip on Darren's recorder shifted slightly, his knuckles whitening. His composure was cracking. Corvin stepped forward, but Leander's gaze snapped to him. "I suggest you speak carefully," Leander said. "Everything you say from this point forward is being recorded, and multiple passengers are documenting it." A beat of heavy silence passed. Then a quiet voice broke through. "He's right," said a man from the front of the cabin. It was the quiet passenger in row 2, the one who had kept to himself since boarding. He wore a navy blue jacket and rectangular glasses, and now he stood slowly, calmly, as if unveiling something long hidden. "My name is Drayen Voss," the man said, reaching into his jacket. "I'm a licensed inspector with the Federal Passenger Aviation Council." The entire cabin went still. Darren visibly recoiled. Corvin's jaw slackened. Leander blinked, absorbing the words. Drayen held up a slim black ID wallet, flipping it open just enough to flash the silver seal and photo badge. "I'm currently on assignment, monitoring compliance across mid-tier airline routes, particularly those with rising misconduct complaints. Arius Jet Flight 409 has now officially triggered a mid-flight audit." He took a step forward. "I'd like a word with the crew in private." It wasn't a request. Darren looked like he'd been doused in ice water. Corvin instinctively glanced toward the cockpit, but Drayen stepped between them. "I recommend you comply," he said, his tone mild but unmistakably authoritative. Without a word, Darren lowered his recorder and followed. Corvin trailed behind, a nervous glance over his shoulder at the watchful passengers. As they slipped behind the curtain, the hum of the engines returned to the foreground, but the tension remained. Leander sat motionless, his heart still beating slow and hard. He looked down. Kalen was nestled into his chest, breathing softly again. The cabin had become something else now. Not a place of transport, but a courtroom, a stage, a reckoning. A woman across the aisle, elderly, kind-eyed, gave a soft nod of respect. A man offered a spare blanket. Another simply gave a thumbs up, quietly supportive. Leander adjusted Kalen's position, cradling the infant securely in his arms. He whispered a low lullaby, voice steady despite the flood of adrenaline running beneath. The baby stirred, sighed, and slowly began to relax. In the curtain-draped galley, muffled voices rose and fell. Drayen was already dissecting the inconsistencies. Leander didn't need to hear it. He had done what mattered, shifted the lens, taken control, protected truth. Outside the window, clouds passed silently by. Inside, clarity had begun to settle. For the first time since the spill, Darren realized the father he targeted was not the victim he expected. Darren lunged. The moment was sharp, sudden, and charged. His arm shot forward toward Leander's chest, fingers curled, aiming directly for the compact recording device clutched in the father's left hand. But Leander didn't flinch. He tightened his grip instinctively, twisting his wrist just enough to pull the device closer to his torso, shielding it with his arm as though protecting a second child. "You are not authorized to film crew members," Darren barked, voice strained with fury, his eyes wide and flickering with the first sign of panic. Leander met his stare without raising his voice. "And you weren't authorized to lie about what happened to my son." The cabin fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the low hum of engines and the faint breathing of a plane full of people holding theirs. Darren stood rigid, fists clenched now, his breath shallow and fast. A few seats back, a young man lifted his phone, then another, then a third. Within seconds, a line of glowing screens aimed like silent witnesses at the scene unfolding mid-cabin. One passenger, seated in row 6, said firmly, "We saw what happened. He's not alone." Darren's face flushed crimson, but his confidence had cracked. He stepped back, flustered, muttering under his breath, "Call it in, Corvin. Now." Corvin Hale, standing stiffly near the galley, hesitated for half a beat too long. Then, pulling a small crew comm from his vest pocket, he nodded and turned away. Leander didn't move. Kalen stirred softly in the crook of his arm, his breathing light against Leander's shirt. The baby hadn't cried again since the earlier incident, but his tiny form trembled faintly, sensing the tension even in his sleep. Leander spoke quietly, eyes on the crew. "If you're calling for backup, make sure they see all the footage, too." And then, before Corvin could speak, before Darren could bark another false command, it happened. "Enough," said a calm, deep voice from row 2. Every head turned. A man stood, tall, composed, and deliberate in movement. He wore a navy blue jacket over a collared shirt, no frills, no branding. His expression was unreadable but firm. In one hand he held an identification wallet, already opened and displayed for all to see. "My name is Drayan Voss," he announced. "I'm a licensed safety inspector with the Federal Passenger Aviation Council." The weight of the title settled over the cabin like sudden cabin pressure. Darren's mouth opened, then closed. Corvin turned pale. The two attendants froze mid-motion, like actors caught in the wrong scene. Drayan stepped into the aisle, smooth and sure. His voice was steady. "I've been observing this incident since before the drink was spilled, and I'll be requesting an immediate review of this flight's cabin conduct logs." He turned to Darren. "Now I'd like a quiet word with both of you. Bring your documentation, all of it." Darren stammered. Of course, sir." Corvin looked visibly shaken. Without a word, he moved toward the forward service area, eyes down. Darren followed with stiff shoulders and a clenched jaw, the authority of his uniform dissolving with each step. The cabin remained quiet as Drayan escorted them past the curtain. Leander exhaled, his first full breath in what felt like hours. He sat back slowly, Kalen's head resting just beneath his chin. The baby made a faint noise, a soft coo, then went still again. Leander shifted his arm and began humming a lullaby, one his brother used to sing when Kalen had trouble sleeping. The notes were low, almost whisper-thin, but they filled the air between him and the watching passengers with something gentle and defiant. From across the aisle, an older man nodded at Leander with quiet respect. While Drayan spoke with the crew beyond the curtain, Leander took the moment to review the footage on his device. The camera had caught the juice spill, the false slip, the accusation, and now the failed confiscation attempt. Every angle unflinching. Truth in frames and timestamps. Meanwhile, in the galley, Drayan's tone sharpened. "I'll need the cabin log, communications file, and your personal crew notes. Now." Corvin moved quickly, flustered, unlocking a storage panel behind the service wall. Darren stood nearby, arms crossed but eyes betraying his rising fear. "You're out of line," Darren said, attempting defiance. Drayan didn't raise his voice. "And you're out of time." A beat passed. Then Corvin handed over a small digital log pad, fingers shaking as he did. Drayan scrolled swiftly, eyes narrowing. He tapped the screen, frowned, then reached for his own encrypted scanner, syncing the logs for evidence tagging. Back in the cabin, passengers whispered among themselves. One man muttered to another, "He's not just a dad, he's a tactician." Leander didn't respond. He gently rocked Kalen, who had fallen back into light sleep. The infant's cheek was still slightly sticky from the earlier spill, but his breathing was peaceful now. Leander used the corner of a fresh tissue, one a nearby father had silently passed forward, and dabbed his son's face clean with care. He glanced toward the curtain. He didn't need to hear the full conversation to know what was happening behind it. The truth, he realized, didn't need volume. It just needed to be seen by the right eyes. And for the first time since boarding the plane, Leander knew those eyes were watching now. Drayan emerged minutes later, a clipboard tucked under one arm and his expression unreadable but clearly firm in resolve. He looked toward Leander and gave the smallest nod, not of camaraderie but of acknowledgement. Then he turned to address the passengers. "There will be a report," Drayan said evenly, "and accountability. Please continue your flight in peace. We'll ensure the skies stay that way." Leander said nothing. He didn't need to. As the plane continued its path through the quiet skies, the balance of power had shifted. Not with a shout, not with rage, but with clarity, preparation, and a simple demand for dignity. Leander didn't need revenge. He needed the right eyes to see what had been hiding in plain sight. Darren Vesk moved quickly, his shoes scraping the cabin floor as he leaned toward Corvin Hale and hissed something low, urgent, conspiratorial. Leander couldn't hear the exact words, but he saw the ripple in Corvin's expression, hesitation first, then forced resolve. And then Darren turned, eyes locking onto Leander with theatrical concern. "There's been a report," he said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Sir, I need to inspect beneath the crib immediately. We've received an alert about a possible concealed liquid container." Leander blinked. For a moment he wasn't sure if he'd heard correctly. The lie was so brazen, so recklessly constructed it stole the breath from his lungs. Kalen stirred in his arms, sensing the tension returning. "No one reported anything," Leander replied calmly, voice low but firm. "You're inventing this." But Darren didn't stop. He took a step closer, arms raised as if approaching a dangerous suspect. The air thickened. The passengers seated nearby visibly tensed, heads turning, some rising halfway in their seats. The same man from earlier, Merrick Teldon, the retired principal, stood again, this time with deliberate authority in his voice. "That's enough," Merrick said. "We all saw what you did earlier. You spilled juice on that baby. Now you're claiming the father hid a threat?" Darren ignored him and pressed forward. "Sir, this is a federal compliance issue. If you do not comply, I will—" "You will what?" another man called out from across the aisle. "Fabricate more charges?" Suddenly, 3 passengers stood up in unison, their bodies forming a narrow line between Darren and Leander. It wasn't violent. It was quiet, unified, human. A wall of reason built not from defiance, but from truth. Darren's steps faltered. "Back off," one of them murmured. "You've done enough." Corvin Hale hovered behind him, uneasily adjusting the tablet in his hand, unsure whether to proceed or retreat. Leander said nothing. He held his son close, his eyes fixed on Darren, not in challenge but in weary restraint. The cabin had become a courtroom without walls, and the jury had already begun to speak. That's when Drayan Voss stepped into the aisle. He moved with calm purpose, the navy blue jacket now slightly open to reveal a lanyard ID. His voice was even, almost conversational, yet every word struck with precision. Darren Vesk, Corvin Hale. I'm Drayan Voss, licensed safety inspector with the Federal Passenger Aviation Council. I'd like a word. Darren froze. Corvin's grip on the tablet slackened. Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire. Every head turned. Passengers who had once been silent now whispered in disbelief. Someone near the front audibly exhaled, as though the pressure in the cabin had finally cracked. I've been monitoring this flight since departure, Drayan continued, stepping closer, and I have recorded audio that pertains to what's happening right now. Darren stammered. You can't just... I can, Drayan said coolly, already pulling a device from his jacket pocket. And I will. He tapped the screen, and a quiet recording played over the cabin's sudden hush. Darren's voice echoed first, clear, sharp, and unmistakable. If he so much as blinks wrong, we hit him with a Tier 2 strike. Father's traveling solo? Easy marks. They panic fast. Corvin's voice followed, lower but just as damning. Let's see how calm he stays when he's humiliated. The cabin erupted, not in chaos but in moral thunder. Gasps, sharp intakes of breath, a shaken, "My God," from someone near the window. Passengers turned to each other in disbelief. What had been suspicion was now confirmation. What had been intuition was now evidence. Leander remained seated, still cradling Kaylin, who looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He simply exhaled, the breath of a man who had waited too long for someone else to finally speak the truth. Drayan turned to the crowd. This was not an isolated incident, he said. I was placed on this flight due to a growing list of complaints about this crew, specifically Mr. Vesk. What happened today was not spontaneous. It was calculated, it was patterned, and now it's documented. Darren's knees bent slightly, as if the weight of exposure was too much for him. Corvin leaned back against the bulkhead, pale and blinking. Whatever plan they had rehearsed had collapsed in a matter of minutes. Merrick Teldon stepped forward again, voice steady, eyes locked on Darren. You turned a peaceful father into a target, he said, but the cabin watched. The cabin remembers. No one needed to raise their voice after that. Leander stroked the soft tuft of hair atop Kaylin's head, the juice-stained blanket long replaced by a fresh one offered earlier. The fight was not over, but the tide had turned. He glanced at Drayan, who met his gaze with a nod, and then looked out the small window beside them. Clear skies stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Darren and Corvin stood surrounded not by force, but by truth, and this time there would be no place for it to hide. This flight wasn't random, it was the final test of a man's pattern. The attendant smirked, confident his act would go unpunished, unaware that every movement, every witness, and every second had already been anticipated by a father who doesn't tolerate harm to his family. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets unstoppable power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The moment Captain Jaron Vielle stepped into the rear cabin, the air changed. He had been summoned by Drayan Voss, who now stood with his back straight, arms crossed and a recorder in hand. Leander remained seated. Kaylin tucked safely in his arms, the damp remains of the earlier juice spill still visible along the infant's yellow blanket. Around them, passengers watched with quiet expectation, their earlier murmurs now silenced by the captain's presence. Darren Vesk stood to the side, his uniform too crisp for the nervous twitch behind his eyes. "Captain," Drayan began calmly, extending a hand. "Drayan Voss, Federal Passenger Aviation Council. I'm going to need you to hear this." The pilot blinked, confusion flickering across his features, but he nodded and leaned in. Drayan tapped the side of his recording device and played a clipped segment. It was the audio, sharp, unambiguous. "Just spill it. Say it was turbulence. No one's going to check if the baby cries loud enough," came Darren's voice. Captain Vale's brow furrowed. Then came Corvin Hale's whisper. "We'll issue the slip. If he pushes back, we escalate." When the recording ended, the captain's face had changed. The professional distance cracked slightly, and in its place settled a grim understanding. He turned to Darren. "Is this true?" His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Darren's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, Leander spoke. "Captain, I need to show you something." He reached into his side bag and removed his own compact device, playing back a brief clip of the moment the juice hit Kalen's face. The camera angle caught Darren's wrist flick, the deliberate spill, and his empty expression afterward. Another tap. The forged slip came into view, along with Leander's voice calling out the inconsistencies, and passengers murmuring in the background. For a long breath, the captain said nothing. Then he turned fully to Leander. "I want to personally apologize," Vial said, his voice raw but composed. "I've received multiple alerts this flight, security warnings about your seat. I see now they were fabricated." Leander nodded once, restrained but firm. "I appreciate that, Captain. But an apology isn't enough. I need your word that no passenger who testifies will face retaliation." Vial straightened. "You have it. I'll put it in writing myself." He turned on his heel and disappeared toward the cockpit, already drafting the commitment. Leander's thoughts moved quickly. He opened his secure messaging app and sent the footage, unedited, time-stamped, to his legal team at Vasidian Labs. He didn't just send a warning, he sent a signal. And that signal had a destination. What Darren didn't know, what Corvin hadn't considered, was that Vasidian Labs had just finalized a tech partnership with Myronport Broadcast Group, one of the most influential regional media networks. A shared data channel had already been tested earlier that week. Now, Leander used that channel again, but not for code. The file transfer was silent, smooth, and efficient. Within 20 minutes, the entire incident, the juice spill, the forged negligence slip, the false accusations, the footage of Darren's aggressive posture would be sitting in an editor's queue, already earmarked for breaking segment priority. As the plane cruised above cloud layers, the tension inside the cabin had changed. The rage had not vanished, but transformed into clarity. Darren stood frozen near the galley, watching as Corvin fumbled through the crew binder. Whispers passed between passengers. One man quietly remarked, "He played the wrong father." Another added, "They thought he'd panic. He turned it into a broadcast." Leander adjusted Kalen gently. The child had calmed, eyes wide but quiet, cheek pressed against his father's chest. He whispered softly, not to anyone else, just to his son. "I told you I'd keep you safe." Darren tried to lean into a quiet conversation with Corvin, but the recorder Drayan had placed on the fold-out tray table was still on. Every word carried now. "Should we flag him as a risk?" Corvin murmured. "No point," Darren replied, the tremble in his voice betraying him. "He's already buried us." Behind them, a young man near the emergency row pulled up the live media tracker on his device. He blinked, then turned his screen toward his neighbor. "It's already trending." Back in the cockpit, Captain Vale signed the commitment document and attached it to the flight's digital log. He looked out the windshield toward the horizon, then quietly spoke to his co-pilot. "Broadcasting at 38,000 feet, he said. "That's new." In row 14, Leander glanced at his screen. The upload had finished. He leaned back, exhaled, and allowed himself a brief, solemn smile. The father, who had been framed as a problem, was now broadcasting the truth at 38,000 feet. The silence fell like snowfall, soft but heavy. After the confrontation died down and Darren was forced behind the galley curtain, the mood in the cabin shifted in the way that only quiet respect could announce. Passengers who had remained neutral or hesitant now moved with intent. A man from row 12, a young father himself by the look of the diaper bag at his feet, walked up to Leander and, without a word, offered a clean baby blanket folded neatly in his hand. "For your son," he said, voice steady. "My kid's grown now, but I carry this one out of habit." Leander took the blanket with a nod, brushing his fingers over the soft blue cotton. Kalen, still resting against his chest, stirred faintly but didn't cry. The warmth of the cabin felt different now, no longer just pressurized air, but something more human. There was a quiet hum of solidarity. Behind the curtain, Darren sat slumped on the emergency crew bench, pale and shaking. The veneer of power he had clung to like a badge had been stripped, revealing the desperation underneath. His hands clenched the hem of his uniform shirt, knuckles white, breath shallow. He stared blankly at the floor, listening to the murmurs from the other side of the curtain, passengers talking, footage being reviewed, statements forming. Across from him, Corvin Hale held his phone tightly to his ear, whispering urgently into it. "I need legal guidance now. I'm telling you, it's bigger than just a complaint." A pause. "Yes," he recorded. "Yes, multiple passengers too. Voss is here. Yes, that Voss." What neither of them knew was that Drayan Voss, after sending the crew conduct file from his tablet, had already triggered a high-priority alert in the system used by the Directorate of Cabin Services. The report included timestamps, visual recordings, forged documents, and an audio analysis of Darren and Corvin's manipulated narrative. The subject line was blunt. "Flight 409. Crew misconduct escalation. Immediate review required." At seat 10D, Leander's phone buzzed silently. He glanced down. A message from Tehran Vale, his operations analyst at Vasidian Labs. Tehran Vale. "Leander, you won't believe this. Just check the manifest. CEO of Arius Jet, Davrik Wren, he's on board. First class, 2A. Leander blinked. The timing was impossible to ignore. Davrik Wren. The man whose airline had just nearly allowed a fabricated security report to unfold midair was seated not 20 feet away, blissfully unaware of the storm behind the cabin divider. Leander's gaze lifted toward the front. The curtain separating first class from economy was thick, soundproofed, a fortress of comfort. Wren probably hadn't even noticed the crying, the confrontation, the passengers rallying in the aisle. He was insulated, physically and socially, from the very reality his airline had fostered. Leander didn't smile in triumph. He smiled in understanding. No press release could hide this now. No executive briefing could spin it. Wren would learn the truth not through filtered reports, but face-to-face, tomorrow, at the Norvane conference. The same stage, the same spotlight. Some careers are built on silence, Leander thought, gently adjusting the new blanket over Kalen's legs. But this time, silence had built a trap instead. The cabin doors didn't open. They just stayed closed. A full minute passed. Then another. The usual announcement about deplaning never came. Murmurs spread through the rows like static. Leander Cross, holding his sleeping son, Kalen, tightly against his chest, sensed the change before anyone said a word. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement on the jet bridge through the narrow cabin windows. A flash of dark uniforms. Boots. Then the soft, metallic click of the door latches releasing from outside. 2 uniformed security officers from Norvane International Airport stepped aboard, flanked by a representative from the Federal Passenger Aviation Council. The lead officer, a tall, silver-haired man with a clipped badge reading Commander Varnell, walked forward without hesitation. He stopped in the middle of the aisle. "We're looking for flight attendants Darren Vesk and Corvin Hale." Gasps broke the heavy silence. Heads turned. Corvin stood frozen near the galley, his lips parted, one hand half raised like he was about to pretend to adjust something on a tray. Darren tried to disappear behind the curtain, but it was no use. The officers walked directly to him. "You'll need to come with us," said Commander Varnell, voice calm but unmistakably firm. "This is in response to a formal directive from the Aviation Council." As the 2 attendants were escorted toward the exit, the cabin erupted, not with outrage but with applause, spontaneous, raw, and fueled by days' worth of pent-up injustice. Some passengers stood, others clapped quietly, solemnly, as if honoring the ending of something wrong. And in the middle of it, Leander remained seated, silent, as Kalen slept with his head nestled under his father's jaw, unaware that justice had just stepped aboard. A man from row 8, the retired principal, Merrick Attendant, approached before disembarking. He shook Leander's hand with a firm, steady grip. "I'll give a statement, full and sworn. What they did was disgraceful." Leander nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you. That means more than you know." At the gate, just past the bridge, a familiar figure waited. Drayan Voss, the aviation safety inspector who had upended the entire power dynamic mid-flight. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture military straight. As Leander approached, Drayan handed him a sealed envelope. "A formal invitation," he said. "You've been requested to participate in the upcoming tribunal review for Arius Jet's internal disciplinary protocols." Leander took the letter with a slow nod. His fingers brushed the seal. He didn't open it. Not yet. Drayan leaned in slightly. "You weren't the first to be targeted, Mr. Cross, but you may be the last." As passengers flowed past, Leander turned to look back at the aircraft that had nearly become a prison. It now stood quiet, sterile, as though the violence had been scrubbed away with the same dishonesty that created it. But truth, once exposed, leaves a stain. That night, Norvain's skyline glittered beyond the conference hotel's window. Leander sat in the green room of the convention center, adjusting the folds of his dark blazer. Kalen lay curled beside him in the travel crib, clean, dry, and peaceful under a fresh blanket. The chaos of the past day had finally faded, but its echoes still lingered. His name was called. Leander walked toward the stage, each step echoing on the polished wooden floor beneath soft overhead lights. When he reached the podium, he didn't launch into his presentation. He looked first at the crowd, tech innovators, investors, government observers, all watching him not just as a speaker, but as the man from the flight. The footage had already begun to circulate. His story had broken containment. From the corner of the crowd, someone stood. Davrik Wren, the CEO of Arius Jet. His suit was impeccable, but his eyes were stormed over with discomfort. He made his way toward the side of the stage during a short break in the presentation and approached Leander with quiet urgency. "We've seen the footage," he said, voice low and steady but lacking the usual corporate polish. "A full investigation is underway. I want to offer a direct apology for the misconduct of our crew and for what you endured." Leander didn't respond right away. He turned slightly, glancing toward the crib tucked beside the podium, where Kalen slept with one tiny hand curled around the edge of the blanket. "I didn't ask to make an example," Leander finally said, his voice clear and even. "I asked to fly safely." Davrik nodded once, slowly. "And now that I've landed," Leander continued, turning back toward the stage, "I plan to finish what they started mid-air, with truth, not vengeance." The security footage began to play. There was no narration, no background noise, just the crisp, muted recording from a cockpit-adjacent camera, one that Darren Vesk had never expected anyone to retrieve. A pause, a lean, a flick of the wrist, and then, unmistakably, the arc of orange juice glinting through the air before splashing across baby Kalen's face. Gasps fluttered through the room like a ripple in water. Some of the panelists leaned forward, others froze mid-note. On screen, Darren's smirk appeared faint but visible, just enough to confirm what Leander had claimed from the start. He didn't blink. Leander sat motionless at the table. Kalen quietly nestled in his arms, eyes wide but calm. The dark slate of his suit contrasted the quiet rage that had once burned beneath it. But now it was something colder, focused, final. Across from him, the 5-member review panel took notes furiously, exchanging glances that no longer needed explanation. Seated at the far right was Drayan Voss, his expression unreadable but his fingers tapped slowly in thought, methodical, exacting. The footage ended. The lead panelist, a sharp-jawed man named Counselor Jareth Velrin, cleared his throat. "That was from the internal cockpit-side surveillance," he said. "Time-stamped, unaltered." The room fell into a heavy silence. Then Leander's attorney, a quiet but firm man named Calvin Dorn, rose. "We also have audio," Calvin said, placing a flash drive onto the panel's console. "Recovered from the crew communication channel, transcripts included." With a nod from the board, the file played. This time, the voice was unmistakably Corvin Hale's. Bitter. Smug. "He thinks he's better than us. Let's see how calm he stays when he's humiliated." There was a collective inhalation around the room. The weight of those words pressed down like gravity. Jareth glanced briefly at Drayan, then back at the screen. Another board member quietly lowered his pen, as though no more notes were needed. Leander lowered his eyes to Kaelin. The boy shifted slightly in his lap, clutching his father's shirt with one tiny hand. That hand had been wet with juice only days ago. Now it was wrapped in safety, but safety that had to be earned through evidence and exposure. "We also have a live statement," Calvin continued, stepping back as the monitor blinked to a video call interface. Merrick Teldon appeared on screen, seated in his modest living room. His voice came through steady and precise. "I witnessed the incident," Merrick said. "I saw Darren Vesk spill that juice on purpose. I saw the forged slip. I saw the cover-up attempt. And I saw Leander Cross do nothing but remain calm and protective of his child. Everything else was a show. A dangerous one." His words struck with the force of honesty that couldn't be rehearsed. After the statement concluded, the panelists turned their attention back to Leander. He hadn't spoken yet. He hadn't needed to. The facts had spoken. The footage had spoken. Even Corvin and Darren, absent from the room, had spoken in the ways that mattered most. In their own recorded words, in the cruelty of their expressions, and in the systems they thought would protect them. One of the younger panel members, a quiet man with a twitching brow, finally asked the question that had been hanging unspoken. "Mr. Cross, would you like to make a closing statement?" Leander blinked once. Then he stood. Gently shifting Kaelin against his chest, he stepped forward, just close enough to the edge of the table that the board could hear him clearly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I brought my son on a flight," he said, each word steady, deliberate. "Not a battlefield." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the board, across the silent observers behind the glass wall, and finally to the camera still recording in the corner, broadcasting this tribunal to the Internal Ethics Board of Arius Jet in real time. "And no parent should have to earn the right to be treated like a human being in the sky." The aftermath spread quickly. News of the confrontation aboard Arius Jet Flight 409 had barely cooled before the airline's executive office issued a terse statement. Flight attendants Darren Vesk and Corvin Hale were placed on indefinite suspension pending an internal review. But to Leander Cross, standing beside the window of his small Vosidian Labs office as light spilled through the blinds, it felt hollow. Kaelin cooed on the carpet behind him, batting at the yellow blanket still faintly marked by dried orange juice. The stain hadn't come out completely. Neither had the memory. Project Clear Sky, the airline's official investigation initiative, launched within days. Pitched as a wide-scale review of cabin conduct, training biases, and incident report handling, it aimed to prevent future misunderstandings. But the term felt sanitized, designed to remove accountability rather than enforce it. Leander refused to be satisfied with silence packaged as reform. He didn't act alone. Quiet calls began. Messages exchanged. Drayan Voss, the federal inspector whose presence on the flight had changed everything, agreed to join him. So did Merrick Teldon, the retired principal who had stood in the aisle like a wall. Alongside several other passengers, they co-authored a scathing report. Cradle Altitude, Protecting Infant Passengers and Their Guardians in Air Travel. Make sure the title sounds like safety, Drahan had advised, reviewing a late draft, but underneath, it needs to carry weight like an indictment. The report was both a blueprint for aviation reform and a quiet declaration of war against negligence disguised as authority. It detailed patterns of crew misconduct toward passengers traveling with infants, especially fathers, backed with evidence from Flight 409. It named tactics: passenger tiering, forged negligence slips, complaint suppression strategies, verbal escalations meant to provoke fear. But most importantly, it offered solutions. And people listened. Forums for airline staff and flight safety professionals circulated it. Parenting networks reposted it. 3 regional airlines signed an open commitment within the first month, promising to adopt parental flight conduct safeguards. These included auto alerts for crew reports filed against single parents and a requirement for random audits of incident logs involving infants. Leander watched it spread not as a viral moment, but as a system finally cracking open. Meanwhile, Arius Jet braced against a larger storm. As the footage from the cabin circulated, Darren's forced spill, the forged slip, the confrontation, passengers from past flights came forward. They shared eerily similar stories. Some had tried to report what happened. Others had been silenced. Within 2 weeks, a legal team assembled. A civil class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of mistreated passengers, its cornerstone evidence drawn from the very moment orange juice touched a baby's cheek. Arius Jet's legal department moved quickly. Leander was offered a substantial out-of-court settlement, the figure typed plainly on crisp letterhead. A clean exit, a quiet erasure. He read the number, folded the page, and said no. "I don't want it," he told the lawyer on the conference call, voice calm but steady. "Redirect it. Set up a fund for others like me, people without camera footage, without a federal inspector on board, people who lost quietly." There was a long pause on the line, then a simple, tight response: "We'll inform the board." The Travel Equity Fund was born 2 days later, seeded not by compensation, but by choice. A fund built not to punish, but to protect. Kalen, too young to grasp the ripple effect he had sparked, became a symbol nonetheless. A photo taken during the tribunal hearing, him asleep in Leander's arms, cheeks soft and peaceful, found its way into an article header. The caption was brief, almost whispered against the noise of outrage. He slept through justice while it rose. It traveled farther than expected, not just reposted, but framed, discussed in town halls, aviation panels, and advocacy workshops. It became a reminder that what starts in silence doesn't have to end there. And somewhere between all the retweets and email chains, something shifted in the public conversation. For once, the world didn't shrug, didn't scroll past. And the world, this time, decided not to look away. The letter arrived on a quiet morning, slid halfway under the front door with the insignia of Arius Jet embossed in blue foil across the top. Leander Cross spotted it as he passed the hallway, barefoot, carrying a bowl of fruit for Kalen, who was already busy on the living room rug constructing an ambitious tower of blocks. He bent down, picked it up without much thought, and nearly tossed it aside until his eyes caught the header line beneath the logo. Internal Directive. Cabin Training Protocol Update. Implementation of Kalen's Clause. Leander froze mid-step. The hallway light streamed across the page as he opened the envelope, each crease unfolding like the quiet conclusion of a long battle. The letter was direct, administrative in tone, but its significance cut deeper than anything printed on paper. The clause was simple, almost unremarkable in length. Effective immediately. All Arius jet cabin crew must refrain from verbally attributing in-flight disruptions to infants or toddlers in the absence of clear, documented cause. Additionally, any incident involving a child passenger must be logged with passenger-side acknowledgement at the point of occurrence. This update will appear in the revised 2026 Cabin Conduct Manual under Section 4.8.2, Kalen's Clause. Leander sat down on the edge of the hallway bench, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. His mind wasn't racing, it was still. Still in that rare, quiet way after something hard has finally been acknowledged by the world. Not corrected, not reversed, just recognized. The silence of the moment was broken by the click of a plastic block falling onto another. Kalen, now 10 months old, turned and looked up at his father with a soundless smile. His tiny hands reached for another blue block, wobbling slightly as he tried to fit it atop a leaning tower. Leander watched him, barely blinking. He thought back to the spill, the cries, the lies, the crowd, the camera in his hand, and the man who'd tried to erase it all with a forged slip and a sneer. He stood slowly and walked into the living room, the letter still open, unreadable now from the blur behind his eyes. Kalen sat on the rug surrounded by shapes and colors, wearing a striped onesie and babbling in contented fragments to no one in particular. Leander knelt beside him, gently brushing a curl from his son's forehead. His voice came soft and steady. "They listened, little one. Not just to us, but to what it meant." He looked back down at the letter, then folded it once, then again, and slipped it into the front cover of a small leather folder labeled Tribunal Archives. But even as he did, the moment didn't feel victorious. It felt necessary, quietly overdue. He stood and moved to the window as the distant sound of an aircraft hummed overhead, crossing the pale blue sky like a silver needle threading its way through the clouds. Kalen followed, crawling with a curious grunt before pulling himself up against the glass. "There it goes," Leander whispered, holding him steady. "That sound used to mean motion. Now it means something else. It means eyes are watching, even when they think they aren't." A pause. Kalen pointed upward and babbled again, tapping the window lightly with his small palm. Leander smiled faintly and lifted him into his arms, holding him close. Outside, the aircraft banked slightly, wings catching the sunlight as it cut eastward toward the horizon. And in that suspended moment, between routine and remembrance, between what had happened and what might never happen again, Leander understood something rare. Not pride, not relief, just peace. He pressed a kiss to the top of Kalen's head and looked out at the sky as the sound of the engine softened into distance. Then, almost to himself, he said it aloud. "Next time we fly, son, the skies will remember us. Because what was poured on your blanket became fuel for something far bigger than either of us could have imagined." Seconds later, the father's retaliation exposed the flight attendants' actions, froze the crew in disbelief, and effectively destroyed their careers. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with precision and unyielding force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores disrespect, recklessness, and the consequences of abusing power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, spark reflection, and inspire conversations about accountability, integrity, and protecting those who cannot defend themselves.